Welcome back, everyone. Today I am working on my 1999 BMW Turbo Convertible, a car that I just finished, pulled off the dyno, made 460 at the tire, and 1 month later, we are pulling the engine. What's so frustrating about this is that it's not actually because of engine failure. I actually would have preferred if that was the situation. I sourced this engine from a parts car. It came out of a turbo drift car. I compression tested it. Everything looked great. Internally, everything looked good. It was pretty limited in its runtime though. I drained the oil on my first ever oil change with the car after making power and could not believe how much metallic I found in it. And I figured, well, we're probably dealing with some rod bearings, we're dealing with something engine related. I flushed it, I drove it some more, and the metallic became so severe that I thought, let's stop now before I destroy my whole kit, my oil coolers, my freshly rebuilt turbo. Let's pull this out and see if this is a refresh or not. What ended up being the cause of the engine failure wasn't engine failure at all, but unfortunately a very, very simple and so stupid a mistake to make when you put these engines together. And that was that the three 10mm bolts that hold the Vanos assembly together were never tightened. So the complete Vanos assembly was rocking back and forth, machining down the threads, and filled the entire engine with metallic, to the point that 2 of the nuts had actually fallen into the head. So this was a matter of probably 1 or 2 more pulls before the complete system just grenaded itself. So as frustrating as it was to have to tear apart the car so early, I was relieved that I had done the smart thing before I just destroyed a bunch of kit. I have never torn apart one of these M52s before. I have done just about everything under the sun E36 related, but thankfully my engine luck has been so good I've never had to do this before. So I brought it to one of the experts, and I brought it to Luca at Fast Auto Concepts in Oshawa, Ontario. I needed his guidance on how to actually build one of these engines properly, so this was going to be a complete teardown, send the block out, and build it back up. First things first, the head had to come off. So we removed all the Vanos assembly, cam trays, caps, and that way we could pull the cams and get down to the head bolts. An important note to make if you're ever tearing down one of these motors yourself, you don't have to remove the camshafts like we're doing. We decided to upgrade it to S52 cams, and I just wanted to go through this whole thing properly, send the head out. But if you are just trying to do a quick and dirty throw a head gasket and ARP studs, as long as those timing chains are undone, it's a really, really easy motor to tear down. However, what was not easy was this crank bolt. God himself torqued this on here. This took us over an hour and a half. We tried every combination of the biggest impacts available to anyone, and this crank bolt would not come off. I only recorded some of this because we were so frustrated trying to get this off. We ended up having to spin it upside down, 3 guys standing on an engine stand. Flywheel keyway in place, sockets jammed in the crankshaft, and a Porsche center lock, like 6.5 foot long breaker bar to crack that bolt. It was brutal. So my advice, if you're doing this yourself, leave the engine in the car, do that crank bolt while it's in there so you actually have something to hold on to, because doing this on an engine stand was, it was terrible.
We're gonna see this on YouTube tonight?
Not tonight, no. I'm just gonna do like a full motor build with it.
That'd be cool.
Just gotta do this for like 9 more years, and then this will eventually pay for itself.
Hey, it's worth it.
With the head off, we flipped it over, removed the oil pump, the splash pan for the bottom of the sump, and then it was main caps. I was really curious to see how these looked, because this engine had over 300,000 kilometers on it. So it was a completely perfect compression test across the board. And everything looked good. Bearings were good. Everything was in great shape. It stank. I could not believe how much the block reeked just because of how much the oil was baked in it. But crankshaft was in beautiful shape. Pistons were in great shape, and it was a really good base to start with.
Iron baby.
And with some movie magic, 3 weeks have gone by and the block was sent off to the machine shop and everything checked out. No cracks, no problems whatsoever. The whole thing was descaled, painted. They took just a few thou off the head and gave it a proper hone. Everything was in spectacular shape, especially when you consider the mileage that this thing had seen. And we were ready for reassembly. My complete gasket kit came in, so this was everything that we needed to seal up the engine for oil purposes, and it was on to assembly of the rods and piston combination. The engine that we're building is an M52 B28, so this is the 328 engine. However, a very, very common upgrade for turbo guys is to do M50 B25 rods. They're a much bigger, thicker skirt, so they hold up a lot more torque than the factory rods do. So they're a factory forged option, so it's essentially a very budget way of getting a little bit stronger bottom end for the car. Before the reassembly of the bottom end could happen, the pistons had to be cleaned thoroughly. This is a really tedious process, but a very important one, because where all the rings sit, they need to spin freely. After 300,000 kilometers, we made sure that we inspected the pistons very thoroughly for any kind of excessive wear that wouldn't allow them to be used, and made sure that they were cleaned as perfectly as we could so that there was no issues with ring sticking. With everything all cleaned up and the block ready to go, I was really excited to get this motor built. Not just because I wanted my car to run again, but I'd never done this before. So this was a total, right from the beginning, learning curve for me. So if anything, I was watching and slightly participating throughout all this. This little brass piece is the oil squirter for the bottom of the piston, something that's really important to clean, because especially on the S52 motors, these get gummed up and cause really bad oil pressure issues. With the crank dropped in, we prepped the main caps, got the bearings installed, and sandwiched the whole piece together.
We'll put it on so it's going to ride the thing on a nice flat spot, right? So get it there, move it so it like, because it has some flex to it, so you want to push it on a little bit, right? And then here, then you spin this until you hit 0.
And then when we torque it, it goes to 50.
As you're holding it, and then you basically to the tick after the 60. And so just, you got to kind of be careful on your range of motion and everything.
Was this 50 or 60 degrees?
50.
50.
You can look at the spec on there again if you want.
But you said the tick, before 60.
Okay, so it's before, yeah, you're right. See, you already fucking got me. So then basically, right like that.
Wow. All right.
That's it, that's all. So then,
cool.
Paint marker. It binds, yeah. Yep. Now,
During my piston disassembly and prep, I broke a bunch of rings trying to take it apart, and I didn't want the responsibility of trying to do it myself. So I let Luca, who's done this hundreds of times, do it himself, and he got all the rings prepped, and the piston and rod combinations were ready to get bolted in. I'll cut that.
Pro engine builder. So I'm not picky on where I'm orientating the. Holy fuck! I'm gonna have to get some old T-shirts or something and wipe these down.
Just worry about the orientation once it goes back together.
Yeah, but when I'm lining up the, because I'm gonna oil it and then split it all around. But when I'm setting up the oil ring, it's near impossible to move these rings independently after they're done. So that's why I'm picky on where they're going.
But the other ones don't matter. You can spin those independently.
Once I oil it and fucking do all this to it, then I'll.
Yeah, I got you.
So, and see how this? It's called a Napier ring. If you look at the cross section, see how it's got that little cutout, almost like a little tooth in it?
Oh, true. Yeah.
Yeah, it's for scraping. So that always goes down, and there is a marking always on these. That one says top.
Just scraping oil from the cylinder, or
Pretty well. It's the way it cuts all the shit off of it, right?
Okay.
Whatever the Basically wrap it around. Top ring's different, but it also has a marking. Even though it doesn't say top, you still put that to the top.
Gotcha.
We smack these around. You want to make sure that the sits nice and even in there, and that the rings actually go into their grooves. Because sometimes you can be just clamping it slightly out, right?
True.
So just take a little bit of time. It's about as tight as I want to put it. And if that's that way, we're going to put that all the way down.
Okay.
Try to line this up the best we can. Now, so a ring doesn't slip out underneath this, you get a little hammer and you just tap it all flush.
Oh, true.
Right, I'm gonna come from this way. Now, if you wanna go under the motor, I'm gonna slam it down. You just guide it nicely onto the crank. See, so I got it in the hole. I can just barely, so now, yeah, we'll actually get right down there, right? And you want to make sure you're not gonna.
You don't want to score it.
No, but you want to make sure it goes in there.
Yeah.
Nice too, right?
Cool. All right.
Just to dead them out. There's room. That's always nice. If that doesn't do that, then there's a problem.
We repeated that process 5 more times and then checked the whole rotating assembly to make sure it was completely free of any spots that felt like there was any resistance, and it all felt perfect. Next up, we installed all the ARP main studs, and then one really important thing not to forget before you put the head back on is to do the timing chain, guides, and the oil pump, because all of those are sealed in behind the timing cover set before you put the head back on. I sent the head out to get it lightly skimmed. They had to take almost no material off to get it back to flat, which is great because that means it was never hot or warped. And then most importantly, I had it tested as well, just to make sure everything was sealing properly. I did not want to get into the cost of redoing a head and valve train for a budget motor build like this. I'm using a cut ring head gasket for this. It's a very, very common and reputable head gasket to use for these turbo engines. MLS is an alternative as well. That's what my last engine was, and I had great success with that. However, I have heard of a lot of people having issues with coolant leaking into the cylinders. You'll see in this clip that while Luke is lowering the head onto the block, I'm feeding the front timing chain through. So we threw a zip tie through the front timing chain. That way I could pull it up through the head while he was lowering it on, being very careful to drop it directly onto the block so we don't move those cut rings. Now, I had a bit of a freak incident during the retorquing of the head studs where one of my used ARP head studs, which as far as I know were only used once, actually snapped, and that was only during the middle way of our torquing process. So I didn't want to take any chances, ran out, grabbed a brand new set of head studs for it, like ARP again, and got them all torqued down to spec, specifically for the ARP studs. Next up was the lifter trays. I cleaned them as thoroughly as I could. That brown varnish you see on there isn't rust, but it's just an oil varnish just from the years of use that I just couldn't get off. But cleaned all the ports properly, lubricated all the lifters very thoroughly so they had plenty of lubrication before the engine got oil pressure on its first start, and repeated this process for every single lifter and reinstalled. You gotta move quick when you're installing these lifter trays, so we set the engine at an offset and just dropped them on really quick before they all fell out. You just need to do it in a really quick way. And once they were all installed, we set the engine to top dead center and prepared for camshaft reinstallation. We installed the cams in an orientation that was very close to what their final timing set would look like, and started torquing them down very gently, just to get the cams seated before final torquing. With the S52 cams installed, I had these really trick timing blocks given to me by a friend, and what we did was we degreed the intake side by advancing it 2 degrees and retarded the exhaust side by 8. This is a fairly proven setup by a lot of turbo guys to help with flow, especially when you get past that 500 wheel setup. We had to get the crank bolt torqued down, so we took the engine off the stand, found a really redneck way of getting it all strung up so that we could torque it properly, and then it was final assembly for the timing gears and vanos. It was a bit of a fiddly process trying to figure out how to get the timing set and the vanos unit installed, but once you've done it once, it's really not bad. Just remember, do not forget to reinstall those 3 10mm bolts because they have to be loose when you install the vanos unit. And after that, everything was retorqued, crank bolt was done, and this engine was ready to go back in the car.
Oh. Good. Oh shit, okay. Go.
Go.
Don't go. No, it just came off the wood. Oh baby! Take these parts, stop. Sick. Nice. Don't take that motor out of your fucking motor falls off the bench. You guys have to strap all that.
Fast forward to many more nights of work. That same engine was reinstalled in the car and it was ready for its first fire up. I was so tired. I worked till like 6 in the morning several times in a row in between all of work to get this car going. What we're doing here is just getting oil pressure up to the turbo and making sure that it's got oil feed. This can take quite a few times. I think it was 5 or 6 cranks that were at least 10 to 15 seconds long just to get oil pressure up. And then once we saw it to the turbo, this was ready for its first start.
Good, man.
Wow.
It's my old motor, that's why, dude.
The lifters are pumping up, that's what that sound is?
Yeah.
I let the car idle for about 5 minutes, just checking for leaks and everything that goes on during an engine swap, and then started varying RPM a lot. Got it up for about maybe 20 minutes, made sure the coolant was bled, and then got this thing out on the road right away. That way you could make sure that it got some miles on it before dyno day, which is going to be the video that you guys see next. We're going to find out how much power this car makes, and I can't wait to share this with you guys. So stay tuned, the video is coming shortly. Thank you so much if you made it this far into the video. I really appreciate it. All the best, guys.